Welcome to a special episode of Issues and Answers, a production of the Government Information Service. And we're going to be discussing development and development in the era of climate change and really what we can do better here in Saint Lucia in that regard. I'm a member of the Development Control Authority. My name is Ignatius George Jr. And today we're going to be discussing with the chair of the Development Control Authority, Mr. Ignatius Jean, and we're going to be discussing very many issues regarding the issue of sustainable development and climate change. Mr. Jean, thank you so very much for joining me here at Issues and Answers.
It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning, Mr. George, and we can discuss and help to inform and educate the public on the workings of the Development Control Authority and how all of that matters in building resilience in our society.
Mr. Jean, before we even actually get into the program, Development Control Authority, lots of solutions know it as DCA. Just tell us a little bit about what that is.
Well, the Development Control Authority is an agency of the government. It's a statutory body, comprises a board of directors, a board appointed by the Cabinet of Ministers, with a chairman, deputy chairman, and several representatives of various technical agencies, the engineering society, the architects, other representatives of civil society. The public utilities have observer status on the board, and a diversity of professionals, so it's a multidisciplinary team. The mandate really is to have oversight over all development in Saint Lucia, be it on land or be it on our maritime spaces. And so that we are a regulatory body to ensure particularly the safety of the public and for the public weal generally. That is really what our function is. And we partner and collaborate with various other state agencies to ensure that we undertake proper development. For example, the Ministry of Health, Environmental Health Department, Sustainable Development, Fisheries Department, Ministry of Infrastructure, Forestry, Agriculture. I mean the gamut of other government agencies who would necessarily have interest in what takes place on the built environment.
Now, institutions like the DCA have been around from before concepts and realities of climate change. But yet still, of course, we'll be hearing a lot about climate change, and I think we're also seeing some of the impacts becoming more real for the average citizen. Of course, one of them being more extreme and sometimes even, one may say, berserk or freak weather events. And we seem to have seen one of those very recently, impacting the north of the island, significant flooding, issues of loss of property, homes being lost, commercial institutions and activities being affected, people losing their vehicles, people losing their animals and pets. Quite a disaster. Where does the DCA fit into all of this?
Okay. You know, some of these events, Calix, if we would take time to go back through the records, we may find that they are not new. It is only that maybe in recent time, because many of us forget very fast, and we don't make use of a lot of the records and the history in making a lot of very important decisions, and which is what we face as a DCA when we try to regulate these types of developments. And we would say, if you're going to put a development in a particular location, we would want you to do an environmental impact assessment, which means that you would have to get the professionals to do all of those studies that will let you know whether this place is really suitable for you to undertake that type of development. And sometimes people believe that the DCA is a stumbling block to development. But no, it isn't. What we are trying to do at the DCA is to be sure that when we're building, and that's why I use the term resilience, And it is about, you can build back better. But before you even build back better, you build properly. So you would minimize the risk of losing what you already have to get back into the expense of building back better. Of course, the safety of individuals and their families, you're going to build on a slope. We would want to see that the development or the proposed development, that you have the proper designs, infrastructural designs, structural designs, certified by engineers and architects, that this will be safe, and how you're going to manage on the slopes, your drainage systems, whether you would need retaining walls. And then if you were purchasing a property from a subdivision, for example, there are people they have land, and it's maybe the fastest way or the best return on your investment if you have land, that you can subdivide it and get a good return on your investment. However, too many people in this society have been left in difficult circumstances, having purchased properties in the past where there was no infrastructure put in. There was a promise to put infrastructure. It's never put in. So what we have done over the years with the DCA is to ensure that any developer with large type developments would put in a performance bond to be sure that we will enforce that you will put in the appropriate and proper infrastructure, or otherwise have an escrow account with the DCA so that we can have oversight of that infrastructure in place, so that the public who purchase these properties would be able to have access, whether it's rain or shine, all-weather roads that are stable. There is proper drainage along the roads and between the lots. That's another big factor, because you have runoff coming from one lot, and most of our developments are on slopes. So what happens to your runoff from your roof, your paved surfaces? What we saw yesterday, in yesterday's event, may be a lot of that type of development where many of them unplanned, some of them were planned, but people do not care about their neighbors, and we all must live in that space because it's going to impact everyone.
Indeed. Now, we're actually already due for a break, and I think so we'll actually take this break early, but when we come back, I definitely want to talk about that point that you're making about neighborly living, because clearly water doesn't seem to care whether it's on your property or your neighbor's property or not. It's just going to obey the laws of nature in that regard. So I want to talk about that aspect when we return. We'll be right back after this.
Oi, you realize you step on my toe.
Well, do something about it.
Gas I bust in that man.
Hold on. If somebody try to cross you and the matting start to take you, no need for war or violence, cause the police there to help you. If a trouble start in this session, alright, no need for aggression. We don't want no violence in the place. Control your temper, respect each other. Don't let no trouble escalate, cause you know better. Control your temper, respect each other. Don't let no trouble escalate, cause you know better. Control your temper. A message from Mission Boys, Studio 758, Acid Creations, and the Royal Saint Lucia Police Force.
Welcome back to Issues and Answers, and we're discussing development, a really important issue which impacts the economy, which impacts how we live, impacts even our health and safety. And we're very pleased to have with us the chair of the Development Control Authority Board. That is established by legislation. In fact, it dates way back to 1971. But we say in Saint Lucia have had town and country planning legislation dating back, I think, to as far as the 1940s, 1950s. And currently, there is the Physical Planning and Development Act of 2003 in place. Now, so very pleased to have you here with us, Mr. Jean. We were just speaking about the whole issue of how what you do on your property impacts your neighbor, and that cascading impact, effectively, of the nature of development. Water doesn't know any boundaries. It's coming up from the highlands, from the ridge. It's trying to get down to the lowest point, getting to the sea. It's going to, cut a course, and quite often that course is not going to be maintained within the rivers and streams that we have. Really difficult challenge sometimes, though, to get people to understand that they have to have some respect for nature and these natural systems.
Well, yeah, it is the sort of challenge that we face on a daily basis as the Development Control Authority. Across the social stratas in the society, across economic stratas, that people believe that they own the property and they have a right to enjoy their property. And some people even cite their constitutional right of their right to enjoy their property as they please. But which is why the state has in place the Physical Planning and Development Act, so as to help you to protect yourself and also to protect your neighbors from your own actions. And so there has to be the concept, a holistic concept of development in the country that we continue to strive towards trying to have the zonal type approach and determine which areas are suitable and those that are unsuitable for certain types of practices. That is still a work in progress. We are not where we would like to be, but it is what we are trying to achieve. In the interim, we also have people submitting, because as I said earlier, people own inherited properties, they are family lands, they are people who have purchased properties as investments, and their surveyors, their land surveyors would try to yield the maximum number of lots so they can maximum their returns on their investment. But the designs of these lots or these properties, we as a DCA must have oversight and go through it rigorously with the multidisciplinary team we have on the board and our technical teams to do the proper appraisals, because it is one thing to see it on paper and it's another thing when you get on the ground, well knowing some of the other hazards that we are faced with and what are the measures that we need to put in place to mitigate and to reduce the loss of life, loss of property, etc. And which is why we have the Physical Planning and Development Act, which is why we have a Development Control Authority in place, so that we can help to regulate the actions by all, including the state, where we decide are we going to put a certain type of building, say a public building, well knowing, and there's a history, if we had done certain EIAs, you would know that at a certain point, maybe it would be a 1 in 50 years, you would have flooding at that level. But we have seen, for example, in the Union and Corinth areas, we have had Tropical Storm Debbie, we've had the Christmas Eve troughs, and I'm sure long before that, other meteorological information we would have had. And we have no shortage of the competencies to do the hydrology and hydraulics to determine some of the levels you would have. And now that you put in place the infrastructure on those slopes, you have a roof covering, say, 2,000 square feet, 1,000 square feet. So that water does not now percolate into the soil. It runs off from your roof into a drain, if there is one. Many times you don't have it. And then there's a concrete pavement. The water doesn't percolate, so it rushes down, which is what you call flash flooding. And that is what the sort of impact we had yesterday. And so we have to plan to mitigate that type of activity and those negative impacts.
Indeed, and you've given us so much to unpack there. We don't even have the time to do it, I'm sure. But of course, that situation we saw yesterday in particular, the issue of setbacks might come to mind, and I know that's one of the requirements that the Development Control Authority quite often asks for, whether it's setbacks from the sea, setbacks from the river, these various buffer areas. But we see time and time again, people don't necessarily respect these types of requirements, setbacks from the roads even. Tell us a little bit about that issue in terms of the challenges of enforcement.
Well, yeah, there's as I said, we tend to be a very, I dare say that can be very indisciplined in the society, and people like to take the law into their own hands and do not like to follow regulations and believe that the DCA is trying to impede development. No, we are not. What we are trying to do is to protect many of us from ourselves and to protect others by the actions of those who do not care. And that's what we are trying to regulate. There are very obvious reasons for having setbacks. For example, you would have listened to many talk shows, yourself being a talk show host, that people would be complaining that some part of the river was not desilted. But you will find too that people have disregarded the setbacks. And so where would the heavy equipment be able to navigate or traverse to get into the riverbed or the other equipment you need to do the excavation, to do the clearing? So sometimes people don't pay attention to that until it happens. There are places where you need to, even with the Solid Waste Management Authority and their bulk waste collection, and you would have seen yesterday fridges, stoves, washing machines, just name it, was coming down some of those waterways. And then they get trapped under the culverts or bridges. And what do you have? People's homes are flooded, businesses are flooded. So it impacts everyone. Then it means a business is ruined, so they may have to send some people home because they cannot continue to operate. And these are the types of real challenges with our officers getting out there and having to serve stop notices on citizens to say, well, you didn't have permission to do this, so you're going to have to come in and we're going to have to address it. You're going to have to put in the proper design, or you have to stop it completely. And some people disregard, and by the time you get into the court system, you know the legal processes, how much time it takes, so people continue. By the time you would get a hearing, you have a structure up, and then we have problems.
Indeed. And of course, we're going to have to take a break at this point. This is going to be our final break. But when we come back, I definitely want to talk about the future, forward planning, what's next in terms of the work for the Development Control Authority. We'll be right back after this.
What's in the food you're eating? Do you really even know? All the chemicals and hormones used to accelerate their growth. All the artificial flavoring, sweeteners and colors too. We consume and we don't spare a thought for the damage that they'll do. No, think about the children. Think about the children. How will we save them? Chemicals and GMOs are not the solution. Use organic and join.
Excessive agrochemical use, additives, and genetically modified foods are harmful to health and the environment. Join the good food revolution. Grow, buy, and consume organic. A message from Rise Saint Lucia and the Ministry of Sustainable Development with funding from the GEF Small Grants Program, UNDP.
The good food revolution.
Welcome back to Issues and Answers, and we're discussing development in the era of climate change. And of course, we're very pleased to have with us the chair of the Development Control Authority board. He is Mr. Ignatius Jean. Mr. Jean, we were talking, of course, about the challenges of the DCA in terms of enforcement. But one of the critical aspects of planning is, of course, forward planning. and putting down a strategy, a plan for development, which would span many, many years, decades, as the case may be. We haven't done a pretty good job of that in Saint Lucia, have we?
No, we have not. There have been attempts in the past. I remember there was once a now famous, the quadrant type development plan. And I guess in the 70s and 80s, there were also some plans, particularly for the Castries area. But to a large extent, they have not been. And one of the things that we, as a DCA board, we have not been meeting just only to have approvals of developments or to go through applications, but it's to set aside special meetings looking at specific policy and how we can be able to pursue the holistic development agenda of the country. There are the aspects of our own regulations that need to be updated, and that's a work in progress. I think now our technical teams are working with the offices of the Attorney General so that some of these could be properly brought to the appropriate places, the Cabinet of Ministers and eventually the Parliament, for having the proper legislation or amendments, as well as the statutory instruments to put in place the regulations, building codes that have been sitting around for a long time but have never really been sort of not endorsed, but to form part of the whole regulatory system, and to formalize it, as it were, through the legal process. That has to be done. So these are bits of work in progress. We have had issues regarding the Queen's Chain, and we had started conversations with some of the other partner agencies to be able to treat with these matters, so that by the end of the term of this board, at least we would have undertaken some of these major ones. But all of that requires the sort of resources into the agency, because as we operate as a board, we are really part and parcel of the Ministry of Physical Planning, and so the human resource capacities are kind of limited, and there are some severe constraints in undertaking a lot of this type of work. Some of it may have to be sourced out, but of course the fiscal situation with the state now can be make some of that a little prohibitive at this point in time. But we have had some good conversations with Minister and the Permanent Secretary towards finding requisite allocations to be able to undertake some of the work.
And of course, I think we've seen a merging of infrastructure and physical development. Quite often we've seen in the past a lot of silos developing and not having to be able to bring everybody to the table to do holistic planning is sometimes a challenge. As opposed to, let's say, a city, for instance, where the municipality will have control over the water, electricity, the drains, the roads. We have a lot of different agencies that are all doing their own things.
Yeah, that is another huge challenge. I think there was somewhere back 1947 ordinance of roads, but the current Physical Planning and Development Act dictates that all roads, etc., have to be under the supervision and control of the DCA. But what tends to happen is you would have the Ministry of Infrastructure undertaking roads, and other agencies might be taking on activities. And sometimes I have had to call on to we as a board have had to call on some of the agencies of the state to say, you are governed under this Physical Planning and Development Act. You cannot be a law unto yourself, so that we can properly regulate these things. But there needs to be certainly a more coordinated, cohesive approach in the way we do things at a state level and at the broader national level.
Of course, coming back to the issue of what we saw yesterday and the issue of drainage, that being a very critical one. So many different actors in play there. Water Resources Management Authority. You then have the Ministry of Infrastructure being responsible. Then the municipalities, the local constituency councils. And of course, I suppose as well, the person who sets aside, who says what the width of the river buffer is the Development Control Authority. Any hope as to how all of them can actually coordinate?
Well, let us hope that some of the recent events will trigger people to move into that direction, to realize that we cannot work in silos, and which is why as a DCA we always have sent applications to the referral agencies, as we say. Many of those of you have mentioned, be it environmental health, the municipal authorities, the Ministry of Infrastructure, Solid Waste Department, so they can give us their informed professional opinions on the way forward, whether they would recommend us proceeding or whether they recommend that we reject the proposal or some of the mitigation measures they would need to put in place. And it takes me back to the importance of doing environmental impact assessments, particularly for large-scale developments.
Indeed. Well, it's been a really interesting conversation that we've been having with you, of course, Mr. Jean, and hopefully we can have many, many more, because half an hour can clearly,
certainly.
We're not even really touching the tip of the iceberg with respect to that. Any parting thoughts from you?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here to share with the public some of what we are all about and what we are trying to achieve. But certainly we would like to see this continue, this process of engaging the public through fora like these, and the technical staff of our agency can also be sharing with the public some of what our modus operandi, as well as their own perspectives on how we should, engage the public and moving forward.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Ignatius Jean, the Chairman of the Development Control Authority, for being our guest here today at Issues and Answers. And that's all the time we have, unfortunately. We do hope that you enjoyed the program, and hopefully there'll be another one coming to you very soon.